It's time?
It's time! It's time! It's time!
It's time!
Is it time?
Hello once more. Welcome to one final episode of Rock and Roll Revival. I am Christopher Nelson. Unfortunately, once again, my co-partner in crime, Elias Guy, could not be here to join us. Now, I did say final, because it technically is the final episode of this season for just a short time. We're going to be going on a short temporary hiatus for nothing more than a month or two. And hopefully, by the time we're ready to start our next season, following winter, Aaliyah will be back here and be ready to start appearing on episodes again on a regular basis and actually be involved in production once more. Aaliyah has made a number of individual segments for Rock and Roll Revival while she's been away, but they have not been archived in the same place as the episodes I've been producing have. So over the season, we're going to take all the works that we've done, we're going to archive them together, ideally on either SoundCloud, YouTube, or both. Those details have not been decided yet. And then we'll actually start the production of the following season, and hopefully we'll have some more creative ideas, because I'm not very good at coming up with those on my own. I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to actually listen to these episodes, however many there actually are. I don't have the numbers, but the numbers don't necessarily matter in that regard. Even just a single ear passing by can help make a show like this sustainable. It is a college program after all. Anyways, I was going to want to try, if I would have known that this was going to be the final episode before I started writing the script and the pointers down, I would have done something a little more grand. Unfortunately, I very recently, before recording this, actually found out it was intended to be the last episode, so sadly, it's going to be a bit more of a standard episode, and not necessarily a big grand finale like I was originally hoping for to do for the final episode, but there's going to be more seasons, so maybe after that season ends, we could do something much more significant. But enough of that exposition and dilly-dallying. Let's actually get into some of the content I wanted to talk about. This episode is going to be a bit more of a subject that's very near and very dear to my heart. Punk! In particular, we're going to start things off with a little bit standardly and start off with a review of what I think is probably one of the better punk albums released in the last couple years, at least from a more significant point of view, a melodic, political point of view, the new NOFX album, First Ditch Effort. Now, the new NOFX album, First Ditch Effort, it came out around the same time as Revolution Radio, so about a year ago, and, like I said, if I had the show a year ago, I would have probably reported on it when it was brand new. Unfortunately, I didn't, but that doesn't mean that we can't do a review on it. The album has a very unified sound to it. It's a good collective from start to finish. The opening track and the closing track, it has a very connecting theme to it, a connecting sound to it. It's very clean for NOFX standards. The album's a little bit slower than some of the other NOFX albums. It's still got those same fast, heavy punk riffs that you would expect, but not the extremely fast thrasher riffs that you would normally hear from NOFX. That this album sounds a little bit more like an Offspring album. Not that that's a bad thing. In fact, it's actually much heavier than most of the stuff Offspring has done in the last couple of years anyways. If you're not sure what I mean when I say the tempo is slower, when you get a chance, you can find this album on YouTube, listen to a few songs, then go back and put on Punk and Drublic, and you'll know what I'm talking about. Now, the actual songs, we're not going to do this rock critic style again and break down each song, because actually many of the songs are very similar. So I'm only going to take the time and point out the ones that I think are significant, the ones that really capture the vibe of this album. Now, of course, the opening track, 6 Years on Dope, is much heavier and deeper than all the other albums, and is the only song that's not fronted by Fat Mike. And it is the perfect foreshadow for the type of album that you're going to hear. It's short, it's fast, it's angry, it's heavy, and it's over as soon as it begins. It sets the perfect tone for the album that you're about to listen to. Now, of course, the single Sid and Nancy was released previously without the intention of being included on this album in the first place. So Sid and Nancy was remixed and put on this album secondarily as the third track, and I think was also released as the first single. Sid and Nancy is a bit more of that slower skater punk thing, a bit of that pop punk sound, as so does the second single, Oxymoronic, which is actually a song about the pharmaceutical industry and how it perpetuates the desire to constantly be sustained on these psychoactive stimulants, basically saying that they're essentially 21st century drug dealers at this point, instead of actual doctors and pharmacists, that they're no longer interested in curing but selling. And kind of plays a little bit into that conspiracy theory that the medical industry could cure these diseases but chooses to treat them, which, by the way, there's no actual evidence that that's actually true, but it just simply brings up that they care more about pushing the products. And in real life, you would actually be surprised the amount of money that these doctors, and keep in mind, these doctors, most of them are either they're close to retirement or fresh out of medical school. They're stressed all the time, and when you're fresh out of medical school and you finish your internship and you actually start seeing patients, you get live patients in front of them, it's really overwhelming. So the pharmaceuticalists act as sort of like a hand on the shoulder that to give you a little bit of security. Well, don't worry, we have a prescription for that. It's very common for them to write big checks to doctors to get them to want to prescribe certain drugs more than other drugs. But now I'm talking about the political sciences of the pharmaceutical industry, and I thought this was supposed to be an album review. Now, those songs like Sid and Nancy, Transvestite Light, which is a song about Fat Mike admitting to want to cross-dress, which has a bit of a correlation because if you watch the videos of them touring the last couple years after this album comes out, now he's regularly wearing skirts and dresses and, women's clothes, and as opposed he never has before. So to a certain degree, I think this album might have been, at least from Fat Mike's point of view, a bit of almost a bit therapeutic. There's also another song, I Don't Like Me Anymore, where he talks about the personal conflict of his life, where he thinks he's not necessarily a nice person to other people, and that he has an anxiety that he has these regrets of the way he treats people versus the way that they would perceive him. And so I think this album might be a bit of maybe his own little therapy session, which it definitely, you could feel the energy, you can hear the anger in the songs. You have those standard fast punk songs, California Drought, I Don't Like Me Anymore, Deadbeat Mom are the standard heavy, 1-2 punk songs that you would expect to hear, the kind you're gonna thrash to. Then you have your slower skater punk songs where you, like I said before, Sid Nancy, Oxymoronic, Transvestite Light, and the last couple songs, I'm Sorry Tony, which is a song about one of his friends passing away. I did not do any research on the song, so I'm not going to say anything else about the song's about, but it has slow piano segments intermixed with the fast punk segments that transition surprisingly well for very contrasting sounds. And the very last song is Generation Z, which is the last song I want to mention about. This is sort of that big grand finale song, the foreshadowing punk song of what a world would become. Every good punk album needs to have a foreshadowing punk song at it, whether it be at the end or at some point in the record. Sex Pistols did Anarchy in the UK, when The Offspring did Pay the Man, when Dead Kennedys did Stars and Stripes of Corruption. Some of the best punk albums end on grand foreshadowing warning songs. A social satire that points out what our world may soon become if we don't take action now, and that's exactly what Generation Z's about. I don't want to say what the actual message is, because as someone who considers themselves a critical thinker, I don't entirely agree with the message. And towards the end, the lyrics and the noises get a little exaggerated. It starts off with a slower, standard, more punk song in the beginning, about the first 2 minutes. In the second 2 minutes, there's no more singing except by a number of backup singers who sound like little girls. So I know Fat Mike has I don't remember if he has one daughter or two daughters. And it wouldn't be surprised though if he got her or them, got one of his children to do a recording bit on this one. It certainly does sound like it, and the lyrics refer to his daughter a lot in this particular song. Now, very similar to the Green Day album me and Aaliyah reviewed, these lyrics can get a little bit vague and pretentious, which is why I'm not hailing it as a significant powerhouse, but it's a good staple for this album. It's a good one to close on. The whole album has a connected sound where, while it is slower but heavier, it's got a bleak, harsh sound to it. They did experiment with more tracks than they normally would, and they implement piano tracks very commonly, and sometimes even horn tracks. Not as commonly as some other punk bands have done in recent years, but NOFX has always been willing to experiment and throw extra tracks onto their band. it comes off really well in this album. It's not overproduced, not at all. So with this whole new bleak sound, there's been a lot of rumors that this was one of the endings of NOFX, that NOFX might call it quits after this, which is really nothing but speculation. Fat Mike has said nothing of the spectrum that he might quit after this, in the same way that we said the same thing about Green Day, possibly disbanding after their most recent album. The only piece of evidence that we have to suggest that this could be the final piece of work that NOFX does is that this album took about 6 years to produce, which in standard music isn't extremely long, but longer than you'd like to wait, especially for a 30-minute punk album. But it's also the longest amount of time in between two NOFX albums. NOFX usually, they crank out albums like clockwork. They're always writing the next album while they're recording the current one. There's always another song to write from their point of view, so it could have been a budget thing. It could have been that he had a specific idea in mind, he had a very specific project he wanted to make, because this album does seem like a step above some of the older skater-style NOFX albums. I feel like that the songwriting has matured a little bit, which is ironic for a songwriter who's 47, but you get the point. The NOFX has gotten a good balance between soulfulness and heavy, angry punk, all combined together to make what honestly I think is one of the best punk albums produced within the last 5 years. And if there's one thing that history has taught me about punk, is that whenever there's a Republican president, especially this one right now, Donald Trump, you're going to get a lot of great punk albums. Now, I'm not saying anything about his presidency or his campaign, but I am going to say that punks always tend to write their best work when they have a Republican president to bounce off of. Similar to Saturday Night Live is usually funnier, except for these last couple seasons, when they have a president that's easier to make fun of. Didn't Saturday Night Live go downhill a little bit after Barack Obama became president, as opposed to when George Bush was president? I think most people can attest to that. Well, I'm going to leave you with a bit of a short song break to show you a couple of the shorter numbers off this album, so you can really get a good feel for the type of energy that it's going for. So I'll leave you with the song 6 Years on Dope. And we're back. Welcome once more. God, wasn't that one fucking thrashy? I love that. I love that about punk. I love the anger. I love that mid-range sound. I just love the tempo. Well, I like a lot of things about it. I like the rebelliousness about that. Now, of course, I still need to fill up about another 15 minutes worth of time, so what was I going to say? What was I going to talk about? Well, something I was thinking about talking about was we brought up, the NOFX album. We're talking a little bit about punk, so why not? What I wanted to ask is, how much relevance does this genre still have in the music industry today? Basically, I'm trying to avoid saying the phrase, punk's not dead, or is dead, or, some other generic question of that nature. That type of thing. What relevance would it have in the genre today? Well, there are definitely punk bands that are definitely household names, and not just bands like the Ramones, Green Day, and the Sex Pistols, but you have ones from a more underground take, not just, The Offspring and NOFX, but, you have household names in bands like Bad Religion, or maybe Sublime, sort of a punk band. Dead Kennedys is a pretty big name nowadays. You have a lot of those standard names that aren't necessarily household, but are household from that perception. The Misfits are really popular. When's the last time you've gone in public and not seen a Misfits shirt? I certainly haven't. You always refer to bands like Bad Brains and Black Flag, and while we don't necessarily consider those household names, they're familiar names. Whatever necessarily happened anyways? We had a genre that was considered so taboo and so shocking that some people were arrested just for having venues that played it in the late 70s and the early 80s. You had that thrash mess metal with that noise metal, that noise punk, when you had Black Flag and the Circle Jerks. And you had a little more melodic political punk that evolved into the early 80s with the Kennedys and the Addicts. Let's not forget the Dead Kennedy's whole Tipper Gore controversy when he got more or less arrested for putting a picture on his album cover. Operation Ivy kind of put a little bit of a ska punk thing into it. There's Rancid, there's Social Distortion. In the 90s, when Nirvana came out, that's what made audiences tolerate that sound. Nirvana is not punk. not in my opinion, but it was closer to punk than any other bands that were popular at the time. When you think about who was popular in the late 80s and early 90s, Guns N' Roses was doing Use Your Illusion, Metallica was gaining a lot of traction in the audience world too, John the Fisherman was brand spanking new. So when Nirvana came around, it made audiences want to maybe justify that taste. It would, how many times do these bands come along at the right time, when the taste desire it? Before Guns N' Roses came out, it was glam rock and glam metal. You had that pop crap stuff, Poison, Whitesnake, Cinderella, garbage, get it out of here. But there was nothing else being produced. They had no choice but to go out and buy a very overrated Twister Sister record, because that's what was being sold, that's what was being produced. And then Nirvana and Guns N' Roses first came out and brought some edge to that classic rock sound, made it hard rock. And so people were swallowing up over that. It made mainstream audiences' ears more palatable for angrier, angstier music, which, not to say hasn't always been here, but has always taken a back seat to the more upbeat, poppier sounds of music, even in rock and roll. And it wasn't really until Nirvana came around that made angry music that people would listen to first. Very rarely was metal at the top of the stream. Very rarely, grunge wasn't even a genre that was around at the time. And punk, nobody gave a crap about punk. But when Green Day would follow up after Nirvana in 1992, they did a little underground work called Plunk, which sold 75,000 copies, unheard of for an independent label at the time. And yeah, Green Day was far more poppy than most of the punk bands that we would consider, but they were considered part of the underground scene at the time. And it was a perfect transition from a band like Nirvana to come out of a skater punk band like Green Day, which laid the groundwork for all the other great punk albums of the 90s to come forward. You had Green Day, which came first, in Dookie, and then audiences' ears were suddenly listening to punk. And then in the following month, in March, we got The Offspring did Smash. This summer, NOFX did Punk and Drublic. Bad Religion did Stranger Than Fiction. All these albums are made by bands that in the punk scene are considered household nowadays. Let's not forget all the underground work at the time, too. Suicidal Tendencies and DRI had already established name for themselves. So it's clear that the genre was becoming more palatable. Then, of course, there's the 2000s, where it kind of sold out. And you got bands like Sum 41 and Blink-182 that are taking pop and making it gentle for 10-year-olds. It's disgraceful. And I actually like Sum 41. Well, just their second album. Their second album's really good. Everything else is either too poppy or overproduced. It's such a strange paradox that you get. It's such a strange genre, too, when you really break it down. It's always been so consistent. Punk's never been less popular with its audiences. It's always had a solid cult fan base. Most music genres do, but there's always been something special about punk because it's always been one of the most, maybe, disliked genres. That's why part of the reason why they call it punk. People use punk in a negative connotation up until bands like Green Day and The Offspring came out in the 90s. You punks better get off my property. Remember when Fear played Saturday Night Live and caused like $20,000 in damage because they brought like a bunch of people to mosh on the stage? If you haven't seen that performance, I strongly recommend you look that up. It's a fascinating show. I have never seen a pit, let alone a general admission standing crowd, on a Saturday Night Live performance. And which that band was only on Saturday Night Live because John Belushi said so. John Belushi's weight carried a lot, and he wouldn't agree to do a cameo on the show unless they had Fear play as a musical guest, because Fear was one of John Belushi's favorite bands. And then, what do? They end up creating one of the most iconic performances in Saturday Night Live history, and then they're banned. Just like Rage Against the Machine. In the 80s, everything was metal, and then Bad Religion came along, followed by Nirvana, and then Green Day, and then in the 90s, everything was punk. What about today, though? Yeah, I just gave you the most vague history of punk that any person who knows what they're talking about could possibly describe to you. I could have gone on for hours explaining the rise and fall and what artists made what impact on who, but I only got a 30-minute time slot. If I wanted to tell you everything I know, we'd have to break this up into multiple episodes. What effect does the genre have nowadays? Well, that NOFX album was pretty successful. What about all the other punk bands? The ones that we know about? What about the works that they're doing? Yeah, sure, Green Day did Revolution Radio about a year ago. You may or may not like that album, but I think most people can agree it doesn't really sound like a straight punk album. I would probably rather just call it a good rock and roll album before I would want to call it a punk album. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't fit into the same genre. The Offspring hasn't done anything. Hell, Bad Religion did a Christmas album a couple years ago. Yeah, it was a charity EP, but there's a strange persona with this. Punk has always had its cult fan base, and has only walked out of the shadows and made itself awkwardly known in mainstream music for a short time. Does it have any impact on the music today? Well, punk has always had a certain impact. Even Slash said some of his favorite punk bands were those 70s corners when you had bands like the Sex Pistols, who we actually did a cover of the Sex Pistols for Slash's Snake Pit. There's always going to be a cult following for it, but how can punk ever become as popular as it once did, when rock music itself can't even become as popular as it once did? When rock and roll music, period, doesn't have a standard mainstream audience, will it ever be the same level as it once did? Probably not, but will rock and roll itself ever get to that same point? I would like to think so. I would love to hope so. Because this is something that history has repeated itself time and time again when it comes to music. When genres become polarized, and Americans become bored of what the top 10 artists always seem to produce, there's always that one rap artist, or rock band, or soul artist, some experimental new progressive group. You know, in the 60s, the Beatles came along and changed everything. In the 70s, Zeppelin came along and changed everything. You know, in the 80s, Guns N' Roses changed everything. In the 90s, Nirvana changed everything. In the 2000s, I hate to say it, but Daft Punk was a pretty significant point in blurring techno and modern progressive rock, which I actually really dislike Daft Punk. But their impact on the music industry is undeniable. And hey, they actually write their own fucking songs, unlike any of the other top 10 artists. So, where's the next band? Ardosa Buckley did a video not that long ago where he said that a lot of people complain that rock and roll is dead nowadays, and then what he went back is pointed out that the pop artists have always been winning. You know, in 1998 when Sweet Child of Mine was released as a single, so was Girls Just Wanna Have Fun, and that song was getting played a lot more on the radio than anything off Appetite for Destruction. So, is it always been like that? Well, he brings up a good point, but the point I wanted to ask is, where's the Guns N' Roses today? Where is the Nirvana of today? Where is that Green Day, Maiden, Sabbath, Zeppelin, the Beatles? Where are those defining rock and roll artists today? Are they all underground? Are they all just never going to get released on a mainstream label? It's a great experimental new sound in rock like Dead Sarah just going to fall to the wayside, while Taylor Swift can just literally write a song with literally no melodic change? No melodic change at all, not even a change in pitch, and have that be a #1 single. Is it a reflection of the industry, or is it a reflection of our intelligence? Well, me and Aaliyah did an episode about this before, and we have seemed to reflect that record companies are desperate to stick to the working formula. They don't want to take the chance of signing a band that won't make any money, because there's a lot less money going around. Bands are getting re-signed to deals that they would have been cut for 20 years ago. Hope's not all lost, but this is like when you're losing a monopoly. And, you know, you only have a few houses and they all have all these hotels and you keep landing on properties, so you gotta sell all your assets just to stay in the game. And, you know, there always is that one lucky card in Community Chest, that one spot, if you could just get that couple extra dollars and get that one freaking hotel, buy that one property that could change the course of the game. You're down by 14 in the fourth quarter. If you could just get that one first down, change the momentum. Which is one of the points I want to bring up for the following episodes that will precede this one. Or should I say succeed this one, my bad. We have spent a lot of time talking about more popular household names on the show. We did reviews for Green Day, Primus, the Foo Fighters, Right now it's NOFX. And I've thought to myself, if we want to revive rock and roll with our show, which is already a stretch in the first place, but if we wanted to, why do we focus so much on the names that everyone already knows about? Well, that's one of the things I want to say. Over the hiatus, starting next season, we will optimally have focused on more underground artists, less household names. We just needed something easy to produce enough episodes to give our show a test run. Now we know what we're doing, and if you come back and follow us for the next couple of months when our episodes start coming back up again, and my partner in crime Aaliyah will be here, we're going to be going into a lot more detail, and it will be a lot higher production quality. And I'll tell you what. Anyways, I am Christopher Nelson, and thank you for tuning in for this temporarily final Rock and Roll Revival episode. Goodbye.
This is Rock and Roll Radio. Stay tuned for more rock and roll.